It was a quiet evening in the small town of Willow Creek. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and purple. The streets were still, the kind of calm that feels almost too perfect. Sarah, a young woman in her late 20s, loved evenings like these. Her daily walk was her escape, a chance to clear her mind and breathe in the fresh air. Tonight felt no different, or so she thought. As she strolled down the familiar path, something caught her eye. A shadow stretched along the pavement beside her. At first, she didn't think much of it. Shadows, after all, were ordinary. But something wasn't right. This shadow didn't move the way hers should. When she stopped, it hesitated. When she tilted her head, it stayed unnervingly still. Sarah shook her head with a nervous laugh, brushing it off as a trick of the dimming light. Still, a strange unease settled over her. The further she walked, the more it felt like someone or something was watching her. Her pace quickened, the sound of her own footsteps suddenly louder in her ears. But no matter how fast she moved, the shadow remained, growing darker, as if feeding off her fear. "Maybe it's the streetlights," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Then something strange happened. The shadow grew longer, stretching unnaturally, almost as if it had a life of its own. Sarah's heart pounded as her breath quickened. This wasn't her imagination anymore. Something was following her. That night, Sarah locked herself inside her home, double-checking every window and door. But even as she sat in her well-lit living room, the unease wouldn't leave her. Her mind raced with questions, one louder than all the others. What happens when the shadow that follows you isn't yours? And so, Sarah's quiet life began to unravel. This was only the beginning. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a heaviness in her chest. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous night. Every creak in the house had sounded like footsteps. Every shadow on the wall had felt like a threat. As sunlight streamed through her bedroom window, she tried to convince herself that it was all in her head. "It's just stress," she muttered, brushing her hair back as she stood in front of the bathroom mirror. But then she saw it. There, in the reflection, was the shadow. It stood just behind her, still and silent, as if waiting for her to notice. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She spun around instantly. Nothing. No one was there. The room was empty. Her heart pounded as she turned back to the mirror. The shadow was gone, but she knew what she had seen. She stepped back, her hands trembling. No, this isn't real," she whispered, trying to steady herself. The rest of the day, Sarah went about her routine, but everything felt off. The shadow didn't appear again, but its absence was almost worse. It was as if it was teasing her, reminding her it could show up whenever it pleased. By evening, her paranoia had grown. She started avoiding mirrors, windows, even shiny surfaces, anything that might reflect the shadow back at her. When her phone buzzed with a notification, she flinched, nearly dropping it. "Get a grip," she told herself, forcing a shaky laugh. But when she glanced at her phone's screen, her blood ran cold. There it was, the shadow, not behind her, but within the reflection of her phone's dark screen, staring back at her like it was a part of her now. Sarah dropped the phone and stumbled back, her chest tightening as fear gripped her. The shadow wasn't just following her. It was inside her world now, creeping into places it shouldn't be. As night fell again, Sarah sat on her bed, staring into the darkness of her room, unable to shake one chilling thought. What if it never leaves? Sarah's third day began under a cloud of dread. The sun was shining, birds chirped outside her window, and the world seemed normal. But she wasn't. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow a threat. She could feel it now, even when she couldn't see it. Determined to break free from this growing fear, she decided to leave her house. "I need to get out. Fresh air will help," she whispered to herself, clutching her bag tightly as she stepped out into the bright morning light. The streets were busy with people going about their day, and for a moment, Sarah felt a hint of relief. Maybe the shadow wouldn't follow her here, not in the middle of a bustling town square. She laughed nervously at her own paranoia. But as she walked past a shop window, her body froze. There it was, the shadow, not behind her this time, but beside her, walking alongside her reflection, just as real as her own. Sarah's knees nearly gave out. She stumbled away from the glass, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel it. It was closer now, much closer. The world around her blurred. The cheerful sounds of the town faded as her heart pounded louder and louder in her ears. She ducked into a quiet alley, desperate to collect herself. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the shadow in the real world. But there was nothing. No shadow, no figure, no explanation. Just her own pounding fear. For the first time, Sarah felt truly helpless. It wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was something more. Something darker, something that had begun to latch onto her life, feeding on her fear and growing stronger with every moment. As the day wore on, Sarah realized a horrifying truth. The shadow wasn't just following her. It was becoming a part of her. Every reflection, every flicker in her peripheral vision was a reminder that it was closer than ever. And now it felt like it was waiting. But for what, Sarah couldn't begin to imagine. By the fourth day, Sarah's life was unraveling. She had stopped going to work, avoided calls from friends, and barely left her room. The world outside seemed safer, until she remembered the shadow could follow her anywhere. Her small apartment, once her safe haven, now felt like a trap. She covered every mirror, turned off her phone's screen, and avoided anything that could reflect back at her. But none of it stopped the feeling. The shadow was still there. She could feel it. When Sarah's best friend, Mia, showed up unannounced, Sarah hesitated to open the door. But Mia's voice was firm and concerned. "Sarah, you haven't been answering my calls. What's going on?" Reluctantly, Sarah let her in. Mia gasped at the state of the apartment. Drawn curtains, mirrors draped with sheets, the air thick with tension. "Sarah, what is this? Are you okay?" Mia asked, her voice a mix of worry and disbelief. Sarah tried to explain, but the words felt ridiculous coming out of her mouth. "It's a shadow. It's following me. I know it sounds crazy, but it's real, Mia. It's in the mirrors, the reflections. It's everywhere." Mia stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "You've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you're just seeing things because of that." "No, Mia. I'm not imagining this." Sarah snapped, her voice trembling. "It's real. I've seen it. It's growing closer every day." Mia tried to reassure her, brushing it off as paranoia, but Sarah could see the doubt in her friend's eyes. She begged Mia to stay the night, too afraid to be alone. That evening, Mia tried to lighten the mood. They watched an old movie on the couch, and for a while, Sarah almost felt normal. Almost. But as the night deepened, Sarah couldn't shake the unease. She glanced at the TV screen during a dark scene, and there it was, the shadow, faint but unmistakable, lingering at the edge of the screen. Sarah's breath hitched. "Mia, look." Mia frowned and turned to the TV. "I don't see anything, Sarah." "It's there." Sarah pointed, her voice frantic. But when Mia looked again, the screen was blank. The shadow was gone. Mia sighed, her tone soft but firm. "Sarah, you need help. This isn't real." Sarah felt the walls closing in. How could she prove something no one else could see? As Mia drifted off to sleep, Sarah lay awake, her eyes darting to every shadow in the room. The shadow wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching, and now Sarah realized it wanted her completely alone. The fifth day dawned with a suffocating heaviness. Sarah hadn't slept. The hours had dragged by as she sat in the corner of her room, hugging her knees, eyes locked on the shifting shadows. Mia was still asleep on the couch, unaware of the nightmare unfolding in Sarah's mind. As sunlight streamed through the windows, Sarah clung to a small shred of hope. Maybe the daylight will make it go away, she thought. But deep down, she knew better. When Mia woke up, she immediately noticed Sarah's pale face and sunken eyes. "Sarah, you need to stop this," Mia said gently. "Let me call someone, a doctor, maybe. They can help." Sarah shook her head. "No one can help me. You don't understand. It's not in my head, Mia. It's real." Before Mia could argue, Sarah stood up, her movements jittery. "I need to face it. I need to know what it wants," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Mia stared at her, unsure whether to stop her or let her continue. "Sarah, what are you planning to do?" "I'm going to look directly at it," Sarah whispered. "No mirrors, no tricks. Just me and whatever it is." Mia tried to stop her, but Sarah was already moving. She opened the curtains, letting in the full morning light. She stood in the center of the room, her shadow stretching faintly on the floor. For a moment, everything was silent. Sarah's heart raced as she stared at her shadow, waiting for something to happen. Then it did. The shadow began to move. Not like a normal shadow, but unnaturally, like it had a mind of its own. It grew darker, sharper, and larger, stretching towards Sarah like it was alive. Mia gasped, stumbling back. She saw it now. There was no denying it anymore. "Oh my God, Sarah, what is that?" "I told you," Sarah cried, her voice shaking. "It's real." The shadow rose, twisting and curling like smoke, but darker, heavier. It loomed over Sarah, silent and menacing. She felt frozen, her fear rooting her to the spot. Then a voice, low, hollow, and echoing from nowhere. "You cannot escape me," it said, sending chills down Sarah's spine. Mia screamed, pulling Sarah back toward the door. "We have to get out of here," she yelled. But Sarah couldn't move. Her feet felt glued to the floor, her body paralyzed by the shadow's presence. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something far worse, something that wanted her. The shadow's form shifted again, its edges reaching out, almost touching Sarah. Mia grabbed her arm, yanking her toward the door. With a burst of strength, Sarah broke free from the shadow's pull, and they both bolted out of the room. As they ran into the sunlight outside, the shadow receded, shrinking back into the darkness of the apartment. For now they were safe. But Sarah knew the truth. It wasn't over. The shadow wasn't just following her anymore. It was claiming her piece by piece. The sixth day was drenched in fear and confusion. Sarah and Mia had spent the night at Mia's place, but neither of them felt safe. The shadow might have been left behind in Sarah's apartment, but Sarah could feel its presence lingering, as though it was tethered to her. Mia tried to bring some logic to the situation. "Sarah, we need to figure this out. Maybe it's, I don't know, connected to something. When did this all start?" Sarah thought back, her mind racing through the events of the past week. "It started after I came home from the park," she said quietly. "The park?" Mia's brow furrowed. "What happened there?" Sarah hesitated, her memory hazy but unsettling. "I found this old locket under a tree. It looked abandoned, so I picked it up. That's when I felt something strange, like I wasn't alone. I thought it was just the creepy atmosphere." Mia's eyes widened. "Sarah, where's the locket now?" "It's in my apartment," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mia stood up, pacing the room. This could be it. What if the locket is cursed or tied to whatever this thing is? Sarah shook her head. "That sounds insane." Mia shot her a look. "Does it sound more insane than a shadow following you everywhere? We have to go back and get it. Maybe destroying it will stop this." The idea terrified Sarah, but she knew Mia was right. If there was any chance the locket was the cause, they had to act. Reluctantly, they returned to Sarah's apartment that afternoon. The building felt cold, lifeless, as if the shadow had drained all warmth from it. Inside, the apartment was eerily quiet. Every step echoed as they searched for the locket. Sarah avoided looking at the mirrors and reflective surfaces, her chest tightening with every passing second. "It's in the drawer," Sarah whispered, pointing to her bedside table. Mia approached it cautiously, her hands trembling as she pulled it open. There it was, a small, ornate locket, tarnished with age. It looked harmless, but the air around it felt heavy, oppressive. As Mia picked it up, Sarah flinched. The shadows in the room seemed to shift slightly, as though the locket had stirred them. "What now?" Mia asked, her voice shaking. "We destroy it," Sarah said, her determination masking her fear. They carried the locket to the building's courtyard, where they found a large metal container. Mia placed the locket inside while Sarah poured lighter fluid over it. "Are you sure this will work?" Mia asked. "No," Sarah admitted, striking a match. As the flames engulfed the locket, a low, guttural sound filled the air, like a distant scream. The shadows around them seemed to writhe, darkening and shifting unnaturally. Sarah and Mia watched in horror as the locket burned, its shape twisting in the heat until it finally crumbled into ash. The air grew still. The shadows stopped moving. For the first time in days, Sarah felt a faint glimmer of hope. "Did it work?" Mia asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Sarah replied, staring at the ashes. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. As they turned to leave, Sarah saw something out of the corner of her eye, a shadow, darker than the rest, lingering on the wall. It hadn't disappeared. It had only gotten stronger. On the 7th day, Sarah woke up to an overwhelming sense of dread. The locket was gone, but the shadow remained. If anything, its presence felt even more powerful, more invasive. Mia stayed by her side, determined not to leave her alone. "There has to be something else we're missing," Mia said as they sat in Sarah's living room, the curtains tightly drawn. Sarah stared blankly at the floor. "What if it doesn't want the locket? What if it wants me?" Mia shook her head, refusing to accept that idea. "No, there has to be a way to fight it. Maybe we need help from someone who knows about these things." Sarah looked up, her face pale. "You mean like a priest or a psychic?" Mia nodded. "Yes, someone who can tell us what this thing is and how to stop it." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed, and they spent the morning researching. After hours of searching, they found a name, Elder Qasim, a man known in the nearby town for dealing with unexplained phenomena. By afternoon, they were on the road, heading to Qasim's small, weathered home. The house sat on the edge of a dense forest, its exterior worn but strangely inviting. Qasim, an elderly man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, listened intently as Sarah recounted her ordeal. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "You've invited something into your life," he said finally. "Not through the locket, but through your fear. These shadows feed on emotions, fear, despair, guilt. The locket may have been the catalyst, but now it has attached itself to you." Sarah's stomach churned. "So what do I do? How do I get rid of it?" Qasim stood and retrieved a small leather-bound book from a shelf. "It won't be easy. You must confront it. Shadows thrive in darkness, but they cannot exist in pure light, both literally and metaphorically. You must face what you're hiding, what you fear most." Mia frowned. "Face it? You're saying she has to confront the shadow head-on." Qasim nodded. "Yes, and she must do it without fear. Fear will only make it stronger." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. How could she possibly confront something that had terrified her for days? Qasim handed her a small talisman. "This will protect you from harm, but only if your resolve is strong. If you waver, it won't work." Mia squeezed Sarah's hand. "We'll do it together. You're not alone." That night, back in her apartment, Sarah prepared for what felt like a battle. She lit candles, opened the curtains to let in the moonlight, and held the talisman tightly. As the clock struck midnight, the shadow appeared, rising from the corners of the room, stretching and twisting unnaturally. It was darker than ever, its presence suffocating. Sarah's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stand firm. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice trembling but steady. The shadow seemed to laugh, a low, hollow sound that echoed through the room. You lie, it hissed. No, Sarah said, louder this time. You have no power over me. You're just a shadow, a reflection of fear, and I'm done being afraid. The talisman in her hand began to glow faintly, and the shadow recoiled slightly, its edges flickering. Sarah stepped forward, her voice growing stronger. I won't run from you anymore. You're not real. You're just darkness, and darkness always fades in the light. The shadow let out a piercing scream, its form collapsing inward as if being sucked into itself. The room filled with an intense light, and then silence. When Sarah opened her eyes, the shadow was gone. The room felt lighter, the air clearer. Mia rushed to her side, tears streaming down her face. You did it, Sarah. It's over. But Sarah wasn't so sure. The light may have driven it away, but in the back of her mind, a question lingered. Had she truly defeated it, or had it just retreated, waiting for another moment of weakness? The 8th day began with an uneasy calm. Sarah felt lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. The apartment was no longer suffocating, and the corners that had once been filled with creeping darkness now seemed ordinary. Mia insisted on staying with her that morning, though she couldn't stop smiling. You did it, Sarah. That thing is gone for good. Sarah nodded, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She had faced the shadow, conquered her fear, or so she thought. Yet, a nagging doubt remained. As the day unfolded, Sarah tried to return to normalcy. She cooked breakfast, cleaned the apartment, and even managed to laugh at one of Mia's jokes. It felt like reclaiming her life after a long, terrifying nightmare. By evening, Mia finally decided it was safe to leave. Call me if you need anything, okay? She said, hugging Sarah tightly. I will, Sarah promised, walking Mia to the door. The apartment was silent after Mia left. Too silent. Sarah busied herself with small tasks, trying to ignore the creeping unease in her chest. She told herself it was just paranoia, but as the hours ticked by, the quiet began to feel oppressive. At midnight, Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The moonlight streaming through the window cast faint shadows on the walls. Ordinary shadows. Harmless. Until one of them moved. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. No, she thought. It can't be. The shadow stretched across the wall, slow and deliberate, as if mocking her. It wasn't as dark or as large as before, but it was unmistakably there. Fear clawed at Sarah's chest, but she forced herself to sit up. I defeated you, she whispered, her voice trembling. You're not supposed to be here. The shadow didn't respond. It simply grew darker, more distinct. Sarah clutched the talisman Qasim had given her, but it felt cold and lifeless in her hand. The faint glow it had once emitted was gone. As the shadow crept closer, Sarah realized the truth. It hadn't been defeated. It had only been weakened, waiting for her fear to let it in again. The room grew colder, and Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs. She scrambled to her feet, backing away from the shadow as it slithered across the floor toward her. You won't take me, she said, her voice breaking. The shadow paused, as if considering her words. Then for the first time it spoke, not in the low hiss she had heard before, but in a whisper that sounded almost human. You don't understand, it said. I'm not here to harm you. I'm here because you called me. Sarah's heart stopped. What are you talking about? The shadow twisted, forming into a shape that almost resembled a person. Your fear, your pain, they brought me to you. You gave me life. No, Sarah whispered, shaking her head. That's not true. The shadow's voice softened, almost tender. You've been running from me, fighting me, but I'm a part of you. I've always been here, waiting for you to see me. Sarah's back hit the wall. She stared at the shadow, her mind racing. What do you mean? What are you? I'm your darkness, it said simply. Your guilt, your regret, your fear. You can't destroy me, Sarah. You can only accept me. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as the truth sank in. The shadow wasn't an external force. It was something she had buried deep within herself, something she had never wanted to face. The room grew still as Sarah took a shaky breath. "If you're a part of me," she said slowly, "then I can control you." The shadow didn't answer. It simply waited, looming silently in the dim light. Sarah stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached out. The shadow curled around her fingers like smoke, cold but not unpleasant. For the first time, she didn't pull away. Instead, she whispered, "I'm not afraid of you anymore." The shadow seemed to dissolve, fading into the air like mist. The room brightened, the cold dissipating. Sarah stood in the silence, her hands still outstretched. She felt a strange sense of peace, as though a long-forgotten wound had finally begun to heal. She knew now that the shadow would always be a part of her, but it no longer held power over her. She had faced it, accepted it, and in doing so found her strength. For the first time in days, Sarah smiled, a real, unburdened smile. The battle was over, but the journey to understanding herself had just begun. The 9th day dawned with an unexpected stillness. Sarah woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, the sun streaming in through the curtains. The weight that had once clung to her, the fear that had gripped her heart, was gone. She felt free, but something was different. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but as she went about her morning routine, the silence in her apartment seemed almost too quiet, too perfect. The absence of the shadow left an emptiness she wasn't used to. The house was calm, but in that calm, Sarah felt something missing, something important. She didn't want to admit it, but deep down, she knew that the battle she'd fought hadn't truly ended. The shadow had been a part of her, yes, but there was still something left unsaid. By the afternoon, Sarah decided to visit Qasim again. She needed answers, answers that the shadow had hinted at but never fully explained. The feeling that the shadow was not truly gone lingered, nagging her thoughts like an echo she couldn't escape. Qasim welcomed her into his home once more, his wise eyes noticing the concern etched on her face. "You've come back, Sarah," he said quietly, as if he had been expecting her. "I need to understand," Sarah said, her voice strained. "You told me that I had to accept the shadow, but I still feel like there's more to it. More that I don't know." Qasim nodded slowly, motioning for her to sit. "There is always more, Sarah. That is the nature of our fears. They never truly leave us, but they can be controlled." Sarah frowned. "But what if I haven't fully dealt with it? What if it's still out there?" Qasim leaned forward, his gaze intense. "The shadow may seem gone, but it's not the shadow that you should fear now. It's yourself. You've accepted the darkness, but it is your light that will determine whether the shadow stays away." Sarah's mind raced. "What are you saying? How do I keep it away?" "You must live without fear," Qasim replied. "The shadow feeds on fear, but it also feeds on doubt. If you question your own strength, it will return. But if you believe in your light, if you embrace who you truly are, it will fade." Sarah sat in silence, processing his words. Could it really be that simple? Could her own belief in herself be the key to keeping the shadow at bay? As Sarah stood to leave, Qasim gave her one last piece of advice. "Remember, Sarah, the darkness can never truly overcome the light unless you let it. Trust in yourself. That is the true power you hold." The drive back to her apartment was long, the roads empty and quiet. But as Sarah looked out the window, she began to feel a shift inside her. She realized she had spent too much time running from her fears, from the things she couldn't control. But now, she had the power to face whatever came next. When she arrived home, the apartment felt strangely different. Not empty, not haunted, but alive with possibility. The light streaming in through the windows seemed brighter, the air cleaner. That night, Sarah stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. For the first time in a long time, she didn't see the girl who was afraid of everything. She saw someone strong, someone who had faced the darkest part of herself and emerged on the other side. "I am not afraid," she whispered to herself, the words carrying weight in the quiet room. Outside, the moon hung high in the sky, its silver light casting long shadows on the ground. But Sarah no longer feared them. She no longer feared the darkness. She had learned to embrace it, and in doing so, she had found her own light. The 10th day arrived with an undeniable sense of peace. Sarah woke up feeling more certain than she had in a long time. The fear that once dictated her every step had loosened its grip, leaving her with a calm clarity. She was ready to face the world, to take on whatever came next. Yet, even in her newfound peace, there was a lingering thought, a question that still echoed in her mind. What would happen if I let the shadow back in? It was an unsettling thought. She had spent so much time running, so much energy focused on fighting the darkness that she never truly considered how to coexist with it. Qasim's words echoed in her mind. The shadow can never truly leave. It is a part of you. Was it possible to truly live without fear? Could she really control the shadow without allowing it to consume her again? Sarah took a deep breath, pushing the questions to the back of her mind. Today was a new day, and she refused to let doubt creep in. She dressed, leaving her apartment for the first time in days, determined to face the world head-on. She went to a local cafe, her favorite spot for quiet mornings, and as she sat at her usual table, she watched the people around her. The conversations, the laughter, the bustling energy, it was all so normal, ordinary. But for Sarah, it was extraordinary. The weight she had carried for so long was finally lifting. She had learned to live without fear, to find peace within herself. That afternoon, as she walked through the city, she saw something in the corner of her eye, something that made her heart skip a beat. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure in the crowd, a shadow familiar but distant. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. It can't be. But as she turned to look again, the figure vanished. No trace. Just the usual buzz of the city, the ordinary noise of people moving about. Sarah took a deep breath, letting the moment pass. It had been a shadow, yes, but it wasn't the same one. It was fleeting, unimportant. Her heart calmed, and she smiled. I've moved on. I can't let fear control me anymore. By evening, she returned home, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. She sat in her living room, thinking back on everything she had been through. The shadow, the fear, the doubts. It all seemed so distant now. She picked up the talisman Qasim had given her, now a symbol of her journey. It had once been a lifeline, a crutch she clung to in her darkest moments. Now it was just an object, no longer a source of power or fear, but a reminder of how far she had come. As she placed it on the shelf, Sarah whispered to herself, I'm not afraid of the dark anymore. I'm in control. The apartment felt quiet, almost serene, but Sarah knew that it was more than just the absence of the shadow. It was the presence of something else, the strength she had found within herself. Outside, the night sky was clear, the stars twinkling like distant beacons of hope. The moon was full, casting its light across the city below. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah was not afraid of the darkness. She embraced it, not as an enemy, but as a part of her, a part of the world she could now navigate with confidence. She had faced her fears, accepted her darkness, and emerged stronger for it. The shadow might always be there, but Sarah was no longer its prisoner. She was free, and as she gazed out the window, the world seemed a little brighter, a little more full of possibilities. The journey was far from over, but Sarah knew one thing for certain. She was ready for whatever came next. As Sarah stood by the window, the world outside seemed to breathe with her, calm and steady. She had come a long way from the terrified woman who once fled from the shadow that followed her. No longer was she consumed by fear or paralyzed by the unknown. The shadow, once a symbol of everything she feared, had transformed. It no longer controlled her life. It was simply a part of her journey, a lesson learned, and a reminder that darkness and light could coexist. She had faced her deepest fears and emerged stronger. Her inner strength had become her true power, and she no longer saw the world through the lens of fear. The shadow, in the end, was not her enemy, it was her guide. Sarah smiled, knowing that life would always have its challenges, its uncertainties. But now she was ready to face whatever came her way with courage, resilience, and the understanding that she could handle it all. For in the end, it wasn't about escaping the darkness. It was about learning to stand tall, even in its presence. And Sarah had done just that. The journey was hers to continue, and the future was filled with endless possibilities.